that this is our talk on dysgraphia research priorities. And I think most of you already know, but just in case, that we are here from Dysgraphia Life. You can find us at www.dysgraphia.life. And the website and the community are really here for education and information, to share helpful resources. This is the expert webinar series. We usually have guest speakers, but occasionally we do a special project ourselves. And then we also share success stories. We have an IEP goals book and a professional database and lots of different resources to help the community as much as we can. So tonight, a few housekeeping reminders before we start. So the chat is open. You should be able to talk amongst yourselves, react to any of the slides, react to the findings that we show you today. And you're welcome to type into the chat. If you have questions for Amy and I, please put them in the Q&A section of Zoom, and we will respond to those questions at the end of the presentation. We often get asked if it will be recorded. Yes, the session is being recorded. The video will be available about 7 days from today, and it will be emailed out to everyone who registered for the event tonight. You can also find it on the Dysgraphia Life website after that week goes by. So with that, the overview of the presentation is really to talk through this project. We're going to give some background on designing meaningful research in dysgraphia. We're going to talk about the project and the community-engaged research prioritization, and then go into the process of what we did and the results. And then, as we said, we will leave some time at the end for Q&A and for questions from the audience. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Amy, who's going to start with talking about designing meaningful research in dysgraphia.
And Jennifer, I'm just going to ask you to keep those slides up for me, and I'll just go through them from your slide deck. So apologies for that. So we're really excited to talk about this work that we've done today. Next slide, please. Because what we've seen over the time that we've been working in this space is that there are a lot of challenges in dysgraphia, and you probably feel this way too. First of all, there's confusion about the definition. We don't have standardized assessments. We don't know how prevalent it is. We don't know how many people are dealing with it and where they are. We don't understand the overlap with other learning disabilities. And we certainly have not rigorously tested most of the accommodations and interventions that are being used today in the way that we really should, to know how they have an impact on people with dysgraphia, whether they are students or even beyond schooling. And we realized that we would just really need so much more research than what's out there. Next slide, please. But we didn't want to jump into thinking about research without thinking about how we address these challenges that we're seeing in the most meaningful way. Next slide, please. You may have some familiarity with the way traditional research has often been done, which is where you have researchers, oftentimes associated with universities or other research institutions, who define their research priorities, sometimes with insight from the community, but getting the insight from the community is really where engagement with the community stops. And so researchers are defining the priorities, the research priorities, with that feedback, but then they're kind of taking it in the direction that they feel like is most important to go. What we're wanting to do is go through this process of shifting that research model. So instead of having researchers define the priorities with a little bit of feedback from the community, we want the community members at the table with the researchers, defining these priorities in collaborative ways and with true community engagement. Next slide, please. And how do we make meaningful change? And what do we mean by meaningful? Our community, all of those who are impacted by dysgraphia, need to help, need to be engaged in determining what outcomes matter most to them, not what outcomes matter most to, in the traditional model, what matters most to the researchers, but what matters most to the people who are impacted. The experiences of people with learning disabilities, their loved ones, educators, and other professionals tell us about problems that need to be addressed, places where there could be a meaningful improvement. And this is really the core perspective that should be driving research, is the experiences of the people impacted by it. Next slide, please. So in the current work that we've been doing, the project aims, we're really focused on this engagement. We knew that the recognized need was that we currently, and when I say currently, it's at the time that we started with this work, we had there was no real significant effort to engage the community in research. And we knew as a long-term goal, we wanted to work to establish multi-stakeholder research projects led by teams that include people impacted by dysgraphia. We had 3 different project aims, which involved building a community around this of trained and active patient and caregiver research advocates to advise and participate on studies in this new way where we have engagement. And we'll talk about this a little bit. It's shorthanded PCORI CER, which is patient-centered outcomes research, comparative effectiveness research, comparative clinical effectiveness research. We also knew that we wanted to identify promising practices for engaging parents, guardians, and other caregivers of students. But for this presentation, we're going to focus on number 3, which is to develop a list of prioritized research topics that could improve health outcomes for those with learning disabilities of written expression using multi-stakeholder input. Next slide, please. I do want to acknowledge that this work is supported through a patient-centered outcomes research institute Eugene Washington PCORI Engagement Award. Without this award, we would not have been able to do this work. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about community-engaged research prioritization and the process that we went through to engage the community impacted by dysgraphia in defining what the priorities are that matter most to them. Next slide, please. In this work, we used a type of study that's called a Delphi study. And if there are folks on this call who have worked in research, you might be familiar with this as a tool that's often used to create consensus around guidelines or around priorities in a lot of different spaces. So what a Delphi study is it is a participatory research strategy that collects expert opinions to form a consensus around practices, guidelines, service priorities, future research priorities, particularly in our case, and beyond that. And so there's a process by which panelists are asked to go through several rounds of feedback on the subject matter, eventually deciding whether there's consensus on the goals or consensus on the priorities. But it is an iterative process, and they go through several rounds of questions. The current project used a modified Delphi process to engage experts in the development of consensus-based research priorities focused on improving the lives of people with dysgraphia. And when I say expert means expert includes people directly impacted by dysgraphia. I don't just mean researchers who study dysgraphia or neuropsychologists who assess for dysgraphia or psychologists, school psychologists, or special education teachers, although all of those people were involved in this. But in this case in particular, expert also includes parents and guardians, also includes people who have dysgraphia. And this research prioritization will help the broader community of stakeholders to co-design the most impactful studies in the future. And when I say co-design, it really is that meaningful participation and engagement of all parties who are impacted by dysgraphia. Next slide, please. So continuing on with discussing who the experts are in research prioritization, we set about to um, find representatives from the community who fell into 5 different buckets. And we wanted to make sure that all of these buckets were well represented on our Delphi panel. So we looked for people with dysgraphia. We looked for parents of children with dysgraphia or guardians of children with dysgraphia. We looked for educators, and those educators included classroom teachers and special ed teachers. We included clinicians, including psychologists, occupational therapists, neuropsychologists, and we included researchers because they're also subject matter experts and often come at things from a very different perspective. And in the formation of our panel, we really focused on making sure that there was good representation from a geographic perspective, from a racial, ethnic perspective, and from a gender perspective. So we really shot for diversity across these groups. Next slide, please. As far as the process goes, we're not going to dwell on this slide a whole lot, but we wanted to give you a general idea of how we started with the development of priorities or research topics to then go through a prioritization process. So we started with the Dysgraphia Life online community. We used a variety of different tools to gather the topics from the community, including a survey, including stories sparking science, which we'll talk about in a minute. And we got over 50 submissions just through a variety of methods from the community that we already have engaged in the past. We also then worked with our Dysgraphia Life Research Advisory Board. These are 10 members of the community with diverse expertise. And with the Research Advisory Board, we kind of whittled down, we kind of collapsed if there were topics that were very similar to each other or overlapped some, we collapsed those into each other. We kind of got things organized into 30 research topics. And then, as I discussed previously, we went through a process with our panel where there were multiple different rounds of questionnaires. Panelists had a chance to add and edit our list. Then we asked them to rank the order of the priority research topics. And then we asked them to rank the research topics that came out of that process into 3 different dimensions that we'll talk about to generate a research priority score. And this, you can see, was an iterative process. We went through each of these rounds with the panelists. We came back to the advisory board. We went through rounds again. And then ultimately, we settled on research priorities. Next slide, please. I think it's important to note this quote from one of our research advisory board members, which really shows the importance of engaging those impacted by a situation or a condition in developing research priorities. And you see that our board member said what people come with are their stories, their questions, their confusion, and their frustrations. Embedded in their comments are interesting research questions. Even though people may not be thinking about them as research questions, these are the seeds through which research questions are going to emerge and get crystallized. Next slide, please. I'm going to say a little bit more about what I mean by that. So back in October 2023, for Learning Disabilities Awareness Month, we collected stories and videos from the community through a dedicated webpage. We conducted some community sharing sessions. We did social media promotion. We did a whole lot of engagement to get stories from the community about their experience with dysgraphia. And we called that our Story Sparking Science initiative. Next slide, please. Some of those community stories you can see here, also all submitted by parents of students with learning disabilities with dysgraphia, talking about their children's experiences. And I won't read through all three of them, but you can see the types of stories that were submitted during that time. Next slide, please. So really, it was about taking those stories, using those sparks to create research topics. Next slide, please. So we're just going to take this one and show you what we did with it, or show you what comes out of it. While my son was diagnosed in second grade, we still faced an uphill battle because there was so little information on dysgraphia and how it differed from dyslexia. I will always wonder how much of the stress, the tears, and the frustration we could have avoided if we'd had better help pinpointing what he needed earlier. This is from a parent. So out of this comes three very interesting and important priorities or research topics that could end up being priorities, including dysgraphia versus dyslexia. What's the overlap? What are the emotional or mental health impacts of dysgraphia? What types of early interventions are there? All three of these research topics came out of the simple sharing of a story. Next slide, please. So the first thing we did was this is a sample of the type of questionnaire that we sent out and how we asked our panel to prioritize. So this is just for illustrative purposes. This does not include our complete list. There's no way anyone would be able to read all of that first round. But what you can see is that we asked them to just directly rank, order all these priorities or all of these research topics, which is hard because we knew from the beginning that everybody felt like everything is a priority. We just need everything. And so this was a really challenging exercise in getting people to really choose. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So with that, I'm going to walk through how did we prioritize from that list once we started putting all of those topics together. So first, let's talk a little bit about that expert panel that Amy talked about. As you remember, we were trying to get many different types of stakeholders and people from different perspectives. And we were also looking to have really good representation across a number of different demographic factors. So this was how the panel ended up sort of playing out. We had people with writing difficulties. One of our larger, well, actually a lot of them are larger audiences, but we have a lot of parents and guardians of people with writing difficulties, friends and other types of loved ones. We had the top two were clinical professionals who work with individuals with learning disabilities, such as psychologists, occupational therapies, and speech language pathologists, all of whom were represented, and educators who work with individuals with learning disabilities. And then we had a segment of researchers across the panel. The panel had 24 people who went through and completed all of the prioritization surveys. So other demographics, the panel was about 30% male, 70% female, which is pretty good. We see a lot of females who tend to do our online surveys and things like that. So we wanted to make sure we had some diversity there. And this is our breakdown by race and ethnicity. We were really focused on making sure we tried to make this panel as representative as possible. And we did a pretty good job. So to give you an idea, this is the percentage of people who represented a certain race or ethnicity on the panel compared to the general population in the United States. So while we were lower than we wanted to be on Hispanic or Latina ethnicity, in general across the board, we did a pretty good job with having a fairly representative amount of people with Asian or Asian American backgrounds, Black or African American, and trying to get a fair amount of diversity in different dimensions. So as I said, this is race and ethnicity. We already talked about sort of professional background and how your experience with dysgraphia was, whether it was lived experience or professional experience or both. We had many different people who fell into more than one of those categories, but we also looked at education level. Here, the education level is a little bit high, but that's because we were selecting for certain types of researchers and professionals within the panel. But you can see there's still quite a mix. And then geography with rural or frontier, suburban, urban, and we had a few people who didn't provide full demographic information, but a pretty good spread across the panel, trying to be, as I said, as representative as possible. So the exciting part, what about the results? How did this play out? What happened? So Amy mentioned the process. What we started with 33 actual topics, of which our research advisory board looked at them and made two different big picture groups. One was, what is dysgraphia? And this included a lot of questions about what exactly comprises dysgraphia? How do you assess it? How do you diagnose it? Does it overlap with some of the other learning disabilities? And then the second big picture group was, what can we do about dysgraphia? So how do you look at interventions, accommodations, implementation into school-based programs, many different things around how do we address dysgraphia? So there were 2 rounds of topic refinement and selection where people were talking about how to make the topics better, and then in the next round really prioritizing. And in the end, based on the prioritization feedback from the surveys, the advisory board chose 12 different research topics for final scoring and prioritization. So I'm going to give you, this is the full list here, which I know is a little bit long and a bit overwhelming, but these are the 12 research projects that went into the survey. I will say what research topics that went into the survey. I will say they did fit in a couple big picture themes. So I have them broken down by theme here. So our final 12 really fit into understanding dysgraphia. As I mentioned, this is really truly understanding what it is, as well as subtypes of dysgraphia, screening and diagnosis, associations between dysgraphia and other cognitive functioning, and how frequently it co-occurs with other neurodevelopmental disorders like dyslexia, and then understanding the areas of the brain and brain functions involved. The next theme was accommodations and interventions. So that was, how do you integrate screening, accommodations, and interventions into the multi-tiered system of supports in schools? How do you develop metrics and measures to evaluate accommodations and interventions? And directly comparing the effectiveness of different accommodations and interventions, alone or in combination, as well as developing new ones to support learners with different types of dysgraphia and sometimes coexisting neurodevelopmental disorders. Our third category was support for children and families, understanding impacts on mental health, strategies to build resilience and to minimize these negative impacts, as well as identifying effective strategies for families and guardians to support children with dysgraphia. And then finally, training and education, developing effective professional training on dysgraphia for anyone who develops programs or works with learners, as well as developing resources for pediatric care providers to have to diagnose earlier, educate parents, and refer for services. So those were the top 12 across those 5 different themes. Then what happened is it went back to the expert panel to really rate these 12 categories across 3 different, what we call dimensions. So all 12 of the research topics were rated by urgency, by feasibility, whether the research could actually be designed to address the question, and then by equity value. And so every single topic was rated on a scale of not at all, slightly, moderately, or very by each panelist on these 3 different categories of urgency, feasibility, and equity value. After that, the responses were scored. They were given points in each category and added up to really come up with what our final research topic list looks like. So By scoring the priorities in those categories, it actually forced us to really consider, and forced all the experts who were ranking to consider how to weigh the different dimensions of importance. Obviously, it's important that things are urgent, it's important that they can be done, and it's important that they can be done equitably. But making everyone score in those categories actually made them really think about, okay, which ones are both urgent and feasible and have high equity value versus one or the other. There was a fair amount of consistency in the scoring across the topics, but there were definitely some that came to the top in each of the three categories. And then all were combined for the final, what we called research prioritization score. So here are the final results. What came out on top as the #1 top research priority was developing effective professional training on dysgraphia for anyone who develops programs or works with learners. Closely behind, we had developing effective ways to screen for and diagnose, integrating screening accommodations and interventions into the multi-tiered system of support at school, and then comparing effectiveness of different accommodations and interventions used alone or in combination, as well as developing new accommodations and interventions. And I could go through the whole list, but I just hit them on the themes. But these are the top 5. You can read them here. And then the results continued. We have the whole 12 ordered out. We know we got comments back from the experts while they were doing this, and we know that this was a very difficult process. Many of them commented on how important all the different topics are and how we really need to address them all, but this at least gives us some priorities and some places to start. Another thing that we heard commonly, which I'll go back for just a minute, is how many of these things need to be addressed before some of the other ones are. Obviously, you have to develop good accommodations and interventions and test them before you can integrate them into schools. So even though some of them are really, really high priority, there are other things that may need to be done first in certain cases to make sure that we get the research done effectively. So with that, our next steps are really to take these research priorities and disseminate them broadly. What we want to do, and the whole end goal of this project, was to start to raise awareness of how much research needs to be done in dysgraphia, to give researchers and research teams that include all these different types of sectors, the clinicians, the educators, the parents and guardians, the people with dysgraphia, include them into meaningful research teams, and potentially get funding to start research to address all of these areas. So we are, now that we have our priority list, we are going to be going out there. We encourage you to share with anyone you can that these are the top priorities in this community informed exercise. And we are really looking in the next stages going forward into 2025 on how do we put together these teams to address these questions effectively. So if you personally are interested in participating in any of these teams or any of these projects going forward, this link at the bottom is our research interest link. It's different from our mailing list. We do have a mailing list, but this is specifically for people who are interested in research opportunities, whether they be surveys, focus groups, and in this case, developing research teams. You can always go ahead and put yourself on that research interest list, and we will reach out about new opportunities. One ask from today is that you go ahead and share our shareable research priority list. You can now find it on our website right here at www.dysgraphia.life/research priorities. We have this nice one-page front and back handout that can be disseminated to people and really shared broadly so that people know what some of these top priorities are for the dysgraphia community. It is Dysgraphia Awareness Month, and so we're using this as a time over the next few weeks to really share these priorities, raise awareness, and start to talk about how we need so much more dysgraphia research. So with that, Amy and I will take questions. I'll pull down the slides in a minute. We're curious if you want to put in the chat what you think of the priority list, what you think, if I can put that back up for a minute, what you think about the different priorities, if they ring true to you, if you would have prioritized the same way. But you can also put any questions in the chat and we would be happy to answer them. I also want to make a plug that it is, as I said, Dysgraphia Awareness Month. And so you saw how impactful and meaningful those stories can be. The story, we are still collecting stories, and you can share your story at www.dysgraphia.life/story. For those asking about the recording, yes, we are recording. It will be available. We always say 7 days. It might be out a little bit sooner since we want to promote it for Awareness Month, but we will have the recording and we'll send it out to everyone who is on the list. Let me go back. I got a few positive comments about the priorities, but I'll put them back up for a minute for the list of at least the top 6 results. And we can put into the chat the actual link to where you can find those on our website. As I said, there's a nicely downloadable PDF that I will put in the chat right now. So feel free to share any questions or comments. We really appreciate you listening to it. We want to give a huge thank you to our panelists and our research advisory board members who helped with this project. It's been a lot of fun to see where it came out. I have to admit, I told some people yesterday that I wasn't expecting developing professional training to be on top as the top research priority, but it is something we hear about all the time as a huge need. And so, exciting to see it right there on the top of the list with a number of other really important things that we need to learn more about. So thank you for your time today. Feel free to reach out either now through the chat or later. You can always send us an email. Our general email address is info@dysgraphia.life, and my personal one is jennifer@dysgraphia.life. So please feel free to reach out if you have research ideas, research collaborations. We want to hear from you because we really want to get these priorities out there and start catalyzing more research on dysgraphia.
And there's a couple of good comments in the chat, and I just want to reiterate, if you are interested in participating in some of the research teams that we'd like to form around these priorities, regardless of how you come to this space, whether you're a parent or whether you're a person with dysgraphia or working in it in some way, whether as an OT or even some of you who may be students and looking for projects around this, please get in touch, because we don't want this to just sit on a paper. We want to actually move this research forward.
Well, and thank you to everyone. I'm going to put a, if I can get to it, I'm going to put a quick poll up. Here we go. Poll. Just a quick poll about how you liked the webinar. So feel free to answer, and we appreciate your time tonight. And as Amy said, please reach out.